Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. This is our desktop lecture on ancient India. Welcome. So last week we covered Mesopotamia and we covered Egypt and we looked at the Kingdom of Israel, and those were all in that general time frame starting around 2 or 3,000 before the Common Era, so 2 or 3,000 BCE, if you will. This week we're talking about ancient India, basically in the same time frame. And a couple of things. We don't have an assignment on India this week, but I do want to go through it, and there's a couple of important takeaways here. Now, like anything else in this class, you don't need to know dates or names or any of that stuff. You don't need to really remember any of that. You can always refer to the book if you need that information. But what I do want you to think about here is the big takeaways from this chapter. First of all, we'll look really quick at where civilization developed and why it developed and how it developed in India. But really, in the big picture, the things I want you to remember are that Buddhism and Hinduism come from India. And we're going to read about the origins of those two religions in this chapter. So that's a really important takeaway. And the reason it is an important takeaway is because when you look at the four major religions in the world right now, Hinduism and Buddhism are in the top four. Okay, so Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. I think Hinduism is about 14% of the world's population, and that's centered in India. So Hindu is really a very regional religion to India, where Buddhism also originated in India, but the largest number of followers of Buddhism is actually in China. So I think 7% of the people in the world follow Buddhism, and 14 or 15 Hinduism, and then the rest Islam and Christianity. So those are important takeaways. At least, if nothing else, it's like, those are modern religions, so you know where they started in ancient India, which is what we're reading about this week. So the other thing to think about when you're looking at these civilizations, especially if you're an American and you haven't traveled much and you don't know world geography, the first thing you want to know when you read about India is where it's at. So it's South Asia, and there's a map. There's several maps in the textbook. I have one of these first ones pulled up. You can see it's in the Indian Ocean, and you can see China is to the northeast, and Pakistan and Afghanistan is to the northwest. And like any civilization we study, ancient civilization, if you want to know where civilization in these areas started or where the first communities grew, look to the major rivers. That's the case in India. Two major river valleys in India we need to pay attention to. One of them would be the Indus River, and then the Ganges is the other. The Indus River civilizations are thought to be the earliest, and that's up here near this Afghanistan, Pakistan area in the northwest. The other thing to think about when you're looking at ancient India, and a lot of these ancient civilizations, India was somewhat naturally protected. A lot of mountains to the north. The highest mountains in the world are to the north, so the Himalayas, Mount Everest, all that stuff is up there. And then, 3/4 or 75% of India is surrounded by ocean. So they weren't prone to a lot of invasions. And when we read about China, it's the same thing. They're so isolated that back in ancient times when transportation was difficult, those civilizations tend to grow up on their own. And they kind of grow up autonomous because there's not a lot of invaders coming in from other areas because it's hard to get there. So that's no different than India. That having been said, though, there were many civilizations that grew up, and a lot of this stuff wasn't even discovered until the 1920s. A lot of what we know about ancient India is from archaeology because there wasn't written records. I mean, the main language that developed out of India was Sanskrit, and that was a spoken language. So again, without written records, it's difficult for us to piece together the history. But we do know from archaeology some of the first digs in this Indus River Valley, as I spoke about. And here's a better map. So there's a town called Harappa right here, and the Harappan civilization is thought to be one of the earliest, and there's a couple of phases of the Harappan civilization, the mature and the early, so on and so forth. Not that important that you know those facts, but just know that these civilizations were growing up on the Indus River around the same time as Mesopotamia and Egypt that we read about last week, and some of advancements. Okay, so Sanskrit wasn't a written language, it was a spoken language, but it was a developed language. You'll read about these Vedics, V-E-D-I-C, the Rig Vedic and the New Vedic, Old Vedic eras. The Vedics are religious texts, so again, similar to what we see in Mesopotamia and Egypt, these early religious texts that really start to define and form these religions. So you'll read about the Vedics and the religious implications, and then there's a couple of pictures in here from this is a Buddhist stupa that was unearthed, so you can see, maybe not comparing them directly to like the pyramids that we saw in Egypt, but again, some of these grand structures built to honor gods, if you will, or to serve religion in some way. And again, sophisticated artwork, sophisticated sculpture, again, very similar to the Middle East. And there are those Vedic ages. Those are religious texts. And that occupies a big part of early India. And so go through this, and again, skim through it at least. Some of the writing isn't real exciting. It's a little boring, but again, it's pretty easy to go through, and I think it gives you a pretty good overview of what's going on in India at the same time frame as what we looked at before. The other thing I want you to take out of this chapter, so the one is to just basically know that Hinduism and Buddhism came out of India, but the other thing you're going to read about is the caste system. You'll also read about something called Varnas, which are similar, kind of earlier. But the caste system, if you don't know what it already is it's this social class system, and it's related to Hinduism. And so some old Hindus still utilize the caste system, and basically the caste system means that you're born into a certain caste or a class at birth, and your family remains in that caste or class, and there's not supposed to be any intermarriages between castes, that sort of thing. And many of you may know a lot about it, and many of you may just learn about it from the textbook. The caste system was officially outlawed in India in 1950, but it goes on, and I posted a link in Blackboard about the lowest class, which would be the untouchables, and COVID, and what's going on right now. So I want you to read that, because part of the goal of this class is to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and is to think about discrimination at the same time. And the lower castes in India are still discriminated against. And I think it's interesting in the standpoint that we learn that these categories, these social categories that were just created 4,000 years ago, are still causing harm today to people. It's really no different than categories related to race and categories related to gender and discrimination, how harmful discrimination is over a long period of time. So that's a big takeaway from this chapter, that the caste system started a long time ago. It's still in place, and it really kind of goes against everything we know in the West about categorizing people, although we do it anyway. But anyway, think about that as you go through, because I think it ties in nicely with this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So read about that, read about Hinduism, read about transmigration and karma, kind of fun stuff, really. The Buddhist religion, Hinduism, has always been very interesting to me, and there's a lot to it about the cycle of death and the cycle of life and reincarnation. It's really pretty cool. So check it out, and then you just go through and you'll read about these different empires that come and go. A pretty typical ancient history. You're talking hundreds of years between these settlements. And so you'll see like the 16 settlements in 600 BCE, but then like anywhere else, things start to consolidate as transportation becomes easier, as roads are built and as chariots are built. And when warriors can get around, that's when you start to see a consolidation of kingdoms. There's a couple of more maps in here to look at. You'll read about the caste system. So do that, and then also there's a link in Blackboard to an article that I just mentioned about COVID and the caste system, so please read that. The origins of Buddhism, the Mauryan Empire, so we're getting a little later now. And then we start to see these empires in India get a little bit bigger as we go on. And that's sort of, you'll see that here. But again, a lot of this is written about religion, and a lot of the states or empires that form are certainly religion-based empires. So these regional states are very tied into religion. And let me just go through the rest of the chapter real quick. I think that's about it. So those are the biggies. So the takeaways: know where India's at, okay, South Asia. Know that Buddhism and Hinduism came out of India, and be familiar with the caste system. And also read the article about the caste system and COVID that I posted, and you should be all set. Next week, we're going to talk about China. I'll see you soon. Be safe. Bye-bye.